Climate change is arguably the greatest challenge that we've ever faced. With atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide continuing to rise and students protesting on the streets, the battle is also being fought in the lab, as innovation is one of the most powerful tools we have in the fight against climate change. Last year, I was one of the leaders of the School Strike for Climate movement here in New Zealand. What started off as a small group of students grew bigger than we ever expected into a network of activists in over 40 communities around the country. Over 9 months, we organised 3 strikes, culminating in our September 27th protest, which mobilised over 170,000 people, putting climate justice well and truly on the political agenda. Behind all the marching and chanting, the build-up to each strike was intense. We not only coordinated logistics, but spoke at other events, worked with unions, and gave our feedback on policy changes. Back in April 2019, School Strike was invited to a youth forum by the Interim Climate Change Committee to provide feedback on their final reports to government. One of these reports explored how New Zealand could progress towards generating all our electricity from renewable sources. The energy sector accounted for 41% of New Zealand's total greenhouse gas emissions in 2018, with electricity generation alone accounting for 5%. New Zealand has already committed to going carbon neutral by 2050 in the Zero Carbon Act, and as our demand for electricity increases, we have to ensure that we do not let our emissions from electricity generation increase as well. To solve this, we could generate more energy from renewable sources, such as hydropower, wind power, and solar energy, that don't contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. In fact, New Zealand already generates 80% of our electricity from renewable sources. The Interim Climate Change Committee also found that New Zealand could move to 93% renewable electricity by 2035, even without government intervention. Unfortunately, closing this gap between 93% and 100% is incredibly expensive because of the dry year problem. The dry year problem states that in a particularly dry or not windy year, we may not be able to generate enough electricity to keep up with demand. To fix this, we would need to build more renewable electricity generators than we would need during a normal hydrological year, which is very expensive. Team this up with the fact that climate change is altering what a normal hydrological year looks like, and the costs keep stacking up. Currently, our renewable electricity is being supplemented by electricity generated from burning fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and natural gas, pumping carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Instead, the Interim Climate Change Committee proposed that we close the gap with a form of fossil-free energy. There are a couple of good candidates for this, including biofuel, pumped hydropower, large battery storage, or hydrogen fuel. Each of these fuels has their own opportunities and challenges, but what makes hydrogen so appealing is that it can be transported easier than electricity in a battery and can make use of excess renewable electricity. Burning hydrogen is much more sustainable than burning fossil fuels. Fossil fuels are made of long chains of hydrogen and carbon atoms called hydrocarbons. When these hydrocarbons are burnt with oxygen, they produce carbon dioxide and water, creating greenhouse gas emissions. But when hydrogen is burnt with oxygen, only water is produced. Both water and carbon dioxide are greenhouse gases, but water is present in the atmosphere at a much higher concentration. Think of burning fossil fuels and generating carbon dioxide like a drop in a swimming pool, while burning hydrogen and creating water is more like a drop in the ocean. Since the swimming pool, fossil fuels, will overflow much faster than the ocean, this can be equated to the more potent warming effects of burning fossil fuels. There are 4 main ways of generating hydrogen, but by far the most sustainable is generating green hydrogen by electrolysis, where electro means using electricity and lysis means to split. In this process, 2 separate reactions are used, one to split water in a reaction that produces electrons, and one to make hydrogen gas in a reaction that uses up electrons. For the specific reaction, at the anode, the electron-producing reaction, water is split into oxygen gas and hydrogen ions, producing electrons. These electrons can then travel around the electrical circuit to the cathode, the reaction that consumes electrons, where they combine with hydrogen ions to form hydrogen gas that bubbles out of the solution and can be stored. This reaction is non-spontaneous and requires energy in the form of electricity to force electrons into the cathode from the anode. In a reaction, energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed. In this reaction, the energy from the electricity is transformed and stored in the high-energy products. This creates a unique opportunity for us to store energy from excess renewable electricity as hydrogen fuel. Just as in the dry year problem, during an abnormally dry or not windy year, we can't generate enough electricity to keep up with demand. During a particularly wet year, we may generate more electricity than we actually need. Right now, during a particularly wet year, we're forced to release water from hydro dams, wasting the potential energy. If we could store this energy as hydrogen fuel, we could profit off our overgeneration, increasing the economic viability of building new renewable energy generators. This all seems like a silver bullet solution, and the idea of using hydrogen as a fuel is not particularly new. So what's the holdup? In 2019, the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment released their hydrogen strategy and roadmap, outlining the potential applications of green hydrogen in particular. The generation and use of hydrogen is not yet widespread in New Zealand, although we already have hydrogen trucks and cars on our roads, and the Provincial Growth Fund is investing in the construction of an electrolyser for an ammonia-urea manufacturing plant. We also have the potential to repurpose existing infrastructure for hydrogen technology. There's a project currently underway investigating the feasibility of repurposing gas pipelines in Taranaki, and the winding down of the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter presents an opportunity to set up an electrolyser and retain jobs that would otherwise be lost. The biggest barrier to extending the use of hydrogen technology to be widespread in New Zealand is the cost. To be able to generate hydrogen, we would need to build or repurpose electrolysers connected to the electricity grid. And to be able to use it, we would need to create or repurpose pipelines and refueling stations for hydrogen-powered transport. A key problem with the way we currently generate hydrogen is the way we store it. Hydrogen can be stored in high-pressure tanks as a liquid or converted to ammonia, which is less hazardous than pure hydrogen. Unfortunately, in the storage process, energy can be lost, but as our storage solutions become more efficient, hydrogen will become progressively cheaper. Right now, the cheapest way to reduce our reliance on fossil fuels in the energy sector is electrification. Think using electricity rather than petrol in short-haul transport, or rather than coal in industrial process heat. Although hydrogen is not as cheap as electrification, there are some situations where electrification can't be used. Electrification will struggle to be picked up in trucks, ships, or planes that travel long distances, because the batteries wouldn't last long enough and would take too long to charge. Hydrogen can also help us profit off excess renewable electricity, which is an infinite resource and will never run out. We could store this energy in hydrogen and then export it to other countries that can't generate enough electricity to keep up with demand or need to reduce their emissions by buying a fossil-free form of energy. New Zealand's energy sector is going to have to drastically reduce its emissions in the next 30 years. It's a target we've set for ourselves in New Zealand law and in international agreements such as the Paris Accord, as well as being an obligation we have to give young New Zealanders a safe climate future. Although hydrogen may not be a silver bullet solution, it will be an important one in a toolbox of solutions to help us achieve our targets. The economic cost of hydrogen technology may be a barrier to its implementation, but we already know the devastating environmental and social cost to continuing to burn fossil fuels in New Zealand. It's simply not an option anymore. At School Strike for Climate, we talked a lot about climate justice rather than climate action. The key difference between these terms is that climate action prioritizes stopping emissions at all costs to protect the planet from irreversible climate changes. Climate justice is a more holistic term that acknowledges to solve the climate crisis, we must address the systems that both drive climate change and perpetuate inequalities. If we prioritize action at all costs, we will further marginalize the communities that will be hardest hit by climate change, in particular Indigenous peoples. In order to truly tackle the climate crisis, we must create a just transition that empowers Indigenous communities and takes lessons from Te Ao Māori. This Māori worldview acknowledges that all living and non-living systems are interconnected and emphasises our role as kaitiaki of the natural environment. The integration of Maturanga Māori and Indigenous knowledge is crucial in our approach to tackling the climate crisis and ensuring a just transition. Hydrogen technology will not only be a technical solution to decarbonise our energy sector, but also contributes to a just transition by providing social benefits. we have the opportunity to create jobs for those previously employed in the fossil fuel industry in regions such as Taranaki, and we won't leave behind rural communities or places not connected to the electricity grid. We also have the opportunity to create new partnerships with iwi groups who are the rightful kaitiaki of the land that provides for renewable electricity generation. Producing hydrogen by electrolysis not only gives us the chance to profit off our excess renewable energy generation, but can provide a fuel for situations where electrification can't be used. It not only gives us the chance to eliminate the 5% of emissions from electricity generation, but revolutionize the 41% of emissions coming from our energy sector. By eliminating the need for fossil fuels in transport, industrial process heat, and electricity generation, just to name a few, New Zealand will be a much better place to achieve our targets laid out in the Zero Carbon Act and in the Paris Accord. 170,000 people marched for climate justice on the 27th of September 2019, creating a social license for innovation and change. If we're going to avert the climate crisis, then generating hydrogen by electrolysis will be a powerful tool in meeting our emissions reductions targets, our obligations to protect the homelands of our Pacific neighbours, and to ensure a safe climate future for young New Zealanders. Thank you.